Sorry, of course, nothing good starts without a mute on when you're on Zoom. So thank you, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this public knowledge webinar on the importance of classifying facilities-based interconnected VoIP as Title II, and why that has become critically important now that we are seeing the beginning of widespread retirement of traditional copper systems by the incumbent local exchange carriers. And to summarize, the Commission has actually been thinking about this and trying to figure this out since 2004. At that time, the Commission was confronted by a petition asking it to classify this voice over IP services, or VoIP, and the Commission did what it frequently does in these situations and hedged. The Commission was able to say, well, okay, services like the one we're on now, Zoom, which don't use public telephone or the standard telephone numbers and just use usernames and ride over the top of the internet, and you need a broadband connection for those VoIP services are information services, and that was a pretty straightforward and easy call. Then the next question was services like Vonage, what the Commission decided to call nomadic VoIP, or the growing number of, at that time, cable operators and other carriers who were offering not traditional circuit switch telephone using TDM, but were beginning to offer a managed interconnected voice over IP service, which was indistinguishable from traditional phone service. It was in fact marketed to consumers as, this is your phone service. You can bring your phone number to it. Use us instead of the telephone company for your landline needs while you're still using a landline, which I will point out many people still do because many of us still need one. This interconnected VoIP, both nomadic and facilities-based, the Commission decided they didn't want to answer that question right away. So instead what they said is, we are going to leave this in limbo. We're going to instead say that when we have to deal with these interconnected VoIP services, we are going to regulate them either as Title II, if we in fact decide someday that they are Title II services, or through our ancillary authority. What is ancillary authority? Well, the Commission has general jurisdiction over all communications by wire and wireless from the first part of the Communications Act, what we call Title I, and the Commission has authority to regulate entities that are communications if that is necessary for it to fulfill its other statutory duties, which is the important hook here. You can't just say, well, you're an information service and you're involved with communication, so I get to regulate you. As the DC Circuit has said, ancillary jurisdiction must be ancillary to something. So for a long time, this was very easy. Facilities-based VoIP was ancillary to traditional telephone service, what we sometimes call the public switched telephone network, because that's the one that the public uses, and that's how everybody communicates with each other. And this, which we call the PSTN, or sometimes just the public switch network, the PSN, was still the primary communications network. And for a long time, this didn't raise too many questions. But then VoIP and facilities-based VoIP and began to displace, and has now displaced, traditional legacy copper line, TDM, for those who are familiar with it, voice service as the dominant form of service. That and wireless. Uh, why is wireless important here? Well, wireless is very interesting because the voice component of your mobile service, the part that is the phone, is a Title II service to the extent that it plugs into the PSTN. That's the definition in the statute. And the commission was clear in the Restoring Internet Freedom Order in 2017, along the way of repealing net neutrality. They also said, we are not expanding the definition of PSN to include IP addresses. PSN, interconnected with the public switch network, means the 1994 style telephone network. Does not mean necessarily VoIP, does not mean anything that's IP based. To qualify as a Title II mobile service, it has to be interconnected with the public switched network. So as the public switched network, the traditional public switch network fades away, we start to have a real problem here because the commission has said SMS, text messaging, is not a Title II service. Okay. Then it has also said that broadband is not a Title II service. Okay. So where does the commission's authority come from for the remaining regulations? And people are like, oh, well, there aren't any. Well, there turn out to be a lot that we depend on. Network reliability and resiliency, the fact that you have to report your outages to the disaster reporting service, the fact that you have to participate in certain types of commission rules such as truth in billing, or that voice communications are protected by very strict privacy rules, the CP&I rules that protect the metadata as well as the actual content of the voice discussion in ways that internet and other non-telecommunication services are not protected. And this goes on. 911 is a telephone obligation. We have a bunch of these that we will talk about, but these are all dependent on the rapidly fading traditional legacy network. So the commission, this is not a surprise. The commission has been planning for this since 2010 when it was first raised in the National Broadband Plan. We spent a good deal of time after Hurricane Sandy talking about this and looking at what's going to happen as these networks are retired. And again, the commission decided to hedge, and they said, well, we're not going to make a decision about whether this interconnected VoIP is Title II, but instead we're going to rely on the fact that you can't turn off traditional TDM without permission from the commission, and we'll use that as a hook to make sure that everything works out okay. Of course, the PI FCC rolled back the vast majority of those rules as well, but so now we are proceeding with the phase out of these traditional legacy networks, which are the entire basis of the FCC's authority over communications infrastructure in this country at this point. And we don't have an answer. So we've tackled this in some ways piecemeal. We've had some workarounds, but all of these workarounds depend either on Congress having passed some special legislation. So, for example, when we had the problem of rural call completion, Congress passed legislation, which again didn't decide the status of the service. They just said, well, for any kind of advanced telephone service, any kind of voice service, the commission can make sure that those calls get terminated. But as more and more of these problems come up, it becomes harder and more complicated for Congress to do these piecemeal. And it becomes less and less feasible for the FCC to use ancillary jurisdiction to regulate interconnected VoIP without an actual underlying 1990s style public switch telephone network, which provides the basis of the authority. This past winter, AT&T announced that they were kicking their efforts to retire their copper footprint into high gear, and that as part of this retirement, up to 5 million people in rural areas would no longer have a wireline option. They would be entirely dependent upon rural cellular. And as frankly, those of us who have dealt with these issues for many years know, and certainly those who live in rural areas know, rural call quality is not necessarily that comparable to landline quality. In fact, in some places, it's virtually non-existent. So we are a country that is now actually moving backwards in terms of telephone penetration from nearly 100% penetration to some number that will end up being significantly lower than that. So what's the solution? Well, either we can prevent people from retiring the copper network so we can have a permanent 1990s style PSTN on which the commission can base its authority, which nobody wants, and certainly nobody on this panel wants, or we can answer the question that the commission has been refusing to answer for more than 15 years. If it looks like a phone and acts like a phone and uses your old telephone equipment like a phone and uses your phone numbers like a phone, shouldn't we just call it a phone? So that's what brings us here today. And that is why we filed a petition asking the commission in March to finally decide that question, because frankly, the time to decide this is running out. As we will discuss, there are already problems that are emerging from the commission's paralysis on this issue. There is a real confusion in the states because of contrary decisions in the federal court, one in the Eighth Circuit, one in the Ninth Circuit, as to whether the FCC's refusal to classify VoIP one way or the other has de facto preempted the states from regulating it as a voice service. So even the states may not be able to take up the slack and protect their customers, and also the impacts on network reliability as our networks are falling apart around us, and on competition, where the barriers that are put in place because we have not, as part of the '96 Act, we did a lot to make competition possible. Those rules don't apply to interconnected VoIP service, and unsurprisingly, the dominant carriers are not interested in helping their competitors by applying the rules that support competition voluntarily in an unregulated market. So with that, let me introduce our panelists who will be able to discuss these issues. First, we have Olivia Wine, who is been representative for the National Consumer Law Center. As I have said, we've both been at this for more years than either of us would care to admit. And she is also on the board of the USAC, the government corporation which manages the Universal Service Fund. We have with us also Brian Thorne, who is with Communications Workers of America. Obviously, the people who physically build and maintain the networks and are therefore well aware of the problems with reliability and where the unregulated networks have been falling apart. And with me also is Sana Sheikh. She is with Granite Communications. They are a competing local exchange carrier, or CLEC, who can speak to the competition problems that we are already seeing emerge due to lack of FCC oversight. So, Olivia, let me start with you. What does all this mean for consumers? The day that the last copper system is rolled up and retired and the FCC hasn't done anything, what does that mean for people in their phone bill?
Okay. First off, thanks, Harold, for the introduction. I do need to clarify. So Olivia Wine, staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center. I am also a board member of the Universal Service Administrative Company, USAC, but I'm not authorized to speak on behalf of USAC or the USAC Board of Directors. I'm here solely in my capacity as a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center. And then now back to Harold's question. What would this mean? Well, it really is like a lack of certainty, a lack of a strong regulatory, clarity. And then probably what it means is uneven consumer protection depending on which state you live in, because it will get patchworky for a while workarounds and other ways to try and address particular one-off situations arise. But what is housed in Title II right now for consumers is, as Harold mentioned, there's strong privacy protections about your billing information. That is your CP&I protections, and they're very, very strong. I think consumers would be very sad to see that go. Another thing that's there is the ability of the commission to do rulemakings like the truth in billing rulemaking. Consumers can easily be slammed or crammed if they don't understand their bills. It's really important to have clear regulatory authority so that we're not in the, oh, please don't do that. Oh, you can't make me. Who made you the boss of me? Oh, please don't do that. Design your bills this way. So when we're in that situation, we're clearly in a weaker consumer protection framework. Another thing that I think consumers will see is when you look at the playing field, who they can choose their service from. So I'm hoping that Sana will get into the competitive piece of this, but also that universal, ubiquitous, affordable, reliable phone service. Consumers right now probably aren't aware of the underlying technology when they're picking up what they have known all along is their phone, and they're dialing a phone number to connect with somebody. As Harold said, it looks like a phone, it acts like a phone, it is your phone. This is voice service. This is traditional voice service. All of those expectations and protections with that voice service shouldn't depend on, some very, very detailed, archaic, architecture of the underlying mechanism for delivering that phone call. Universal service is embedded in Title II. And this was really important to ensure that all consumers everywhere had access to voice service. During emergencies, you need voice service. Staying connected to friends and family is critical. Calling a hotline to figure out more information, how you get benefits, or if something bad has happened, like a natural disaster in an area, where to go, where are the centers to go to get help? What happens after a disaster? Like how that communications infrastructure is rebuilt these are important questions, but underlying it all is like knowledge that there's firm regulatory footing for strong state and federal regulation versus, a framework which will potentially be patchwork, ad hoc workarounds, and very issue specific workarounds that will differ depending on the type of protection we're talking about. So, I guess maybe the short answer is the easy way out of this is the reclassification of the interconnected VoIP as Title II, or not just clear classification. Let's declare it. Let's treat voice as voice. I will have a caveat later when we get to talking about nomadic voice and TCPA, which I'd like to.
Let's get that out of the way now, because I want to emphasize for everyone just how narrow this is, just how light the lift is for the FCC, because this tends to get blown out of proportion by opponents. Say, oh, you're going to, impose all these 1934 monopoly regulations on Zoom or Vonage, and no, we're not asking about this service, which has already been classified as an information service. We're not even asking about Vonage, which is enough different from the traditional facilities-based voice service to be a different question. We are just asking about that thing that's connected to your wall, the facilities-based phone service. And we're just asking the FCC to say that a phone is a phone. But Olivia, I know you want to explain why that's an important distinction with regard to robocalls.
Right. The nomadic VoIP providers are the ones that tend to, well, they're the ones that are sending the fraudulent, will tend to be the ones sending the fraudulent calls to voice subscribers in the US. And so they are nomadic, they're non-facilities based, they rely on just, riding on top of the broadband to connect. They, a lot, because if they are outside of Title II, there are some current activities. There's current litigation in a couple of the states with state attorneys general using other laws, state unfair deceptive acts and practices laws, as well as I'm sorry, I'm just falling off base. Anyway, that needs to stay outside of the Title II realm to move forward. We just need all the tools in our tool belt to fight the robocalls, which is the caller authentication issue is different, which is an aspect of the robocalls problem, which would be covered in this a phone is a phone is a phone. But the nomadic is going to be treated differently.
It's more complicated. Exactly.
It is more complicated. They don't have their own voice delivery network through which they serve their subscribers. These nomadic providers rely on another company's broadband internet service to perpetuate, their fraudulent activities. So we just want to be clear that that's outside of the scope of this very narrow ask. Right. We are focused here today to talk about the interconnected VoIP.
Right. Sweep away all the potential distractions, get away from all of these, possible complications. We can deal with that another day, to preserve the FCC's authority over our national communications network. We need the FCC to just do one little thing. Say that a phone is a phone. And with that, let me turn to Brian to talk about the importance of this to network reliability and network resiliency.
Yeah, thank you, Harold, for the question, and thank you to PK for inviting CWA's perspective. As you know, one of the Commission's core responsibilities is promoting public safety through communications technologies and ensuring a reliable and resilient communications network, including one that can withstand natural disasters and emergencies. However, once traditional phone service is phased out, the Commission's authority over VoIP will be questionable because the agency will no longer have the ancillary authority, which you, Harold, talked about earlier. This will prevent the Commission from, amongst other things, ensuring that phones work during emergencies by mandating that carriers work together to cover each other's traffic, but also by requiring providers to replace discontinued and destroyed networks with networks that are at least as good or better than what was previously there. So, in other words, failing to classify VoIP service as Title II will result in a crisis of authority that will leave the Commission unable to safeguard the public and ensure a reliable and resilient communications infrastructure. And we're already starting to see some of the trouble of this, right? When the Commission sought to impose mandatory backup requirements on wireless services pursuant to its ancillary authority in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, the Commission faced strong resistance from the DC Circuit and ultimately abandoned the effort. And when you don't have meaningful requirements, companies won't restore service in a timely manner. And our members have seen this on the ground. So for an example, this was an issue in Florida in the aftermath of Hurricane Michael in 2018. And based on interviews with CWA members, it appeared that Unity, which is a Verizon wireless subcontractor, which opens up a whole other realm of issues, this company had relatively few employees in-house and was not able to quickly deploy a high number of restoration crew personnel. One AT&T technician who was on the ground stated that he did not see Unity linemen placing fiber until 7 or 10 days after the storm. If this pace, if true, is unacceptable, and it's what will happen more and more frequently absent FCC authority to put in place meaningful requirements.
Yes, and just again to remind folks, we're talking about this impacting wireless networks as well, because the Title II definition for the voice component of mobile services is dependent on interconnection with this public switch network. If that goes away, then while there is some authority through Title III over wireless providers, the Commission will not be able to treat them as common carriers, and therefore many of the protections that we take for granted in wireless phones will disappear as well. So saying just let's all switch to wireless isn't going to solve the network reliability problem and isn't going to address a lot of these problems. So in fact, let me now turn to Sana. You represent a CLEC that serves rural America as well as urban America. Why is competition so important here, and how does Title II make that competition possible?
Absolutely. First off, thank you, Harold and Public Knowledge, for hosting this webinar. It's a really important topic. I'm glad there's a lot of attention on it. And hopefully this is going to press the Commission to classify VoIP as a Title II telecommunications service sooner rather than later. I think that's the direction that we're headed in. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Granite, Granite is a telecommunications carrier based out of Quincy, Massachusetts. We provide communication solutions for businesses and government agencies, not consumers directly, but consumers in that way through those businesses throughout the United States and Canada. We started in 2002 as an aggregator of plain old telephone services nationwide with one priority in mind: the customer. That's our focus. What does the customer need? What does the customer want? And how can we get that over to the customer? Today, we service over 2 million voice and data lines to large and small businesses and government agencies, ranging from that mom and pop pizza shop all the way to the United States Postal Service. We've become a leader in phone service, but we've also extended that unique value proposition of one company, one contact, one bill, to include a range of other business communication services, including internet access, SD-WAN, wireless WAN, hosted, SIP trunking, mobile voice and data. Again, focusing on what the customers want. And to answer your question, Harold, what do customers want? They want competition. Why do they want competition? Competition gives them affordability in services. Competition gives them a superior customer service. Competition gives them options. It gives them choices. Nobody wants to be told, hey, your only provider is, let's say, Comcast. That's the only person you can choose. Comcast can then go ahead and they can price gouge. They can limit their customer service. They can really hurt a business if they're not focusing on at least what Granite's focusing on, which is the customer. Competition allows and makes that available. So how does Title II provide competition? So we've covered this a little bit, but I'll kind of go into a little bit more the protections under Section 251. So currently the FCC has jurisdiction and authority to regulate interconnection between carriers under Section 251. So this means that the FCC is required to enforce a carrier's duty to provide another carrier with interconnection to that carrier's network for the transmission and routing of telephone calls with at least equal quality at rates, terms, and conditions that are just, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. Those protections are important. This only right now applies to traditional telecommunication services under Title II. So these are usually those telephone lines that are operating over copper infrastructure. But over the last few years, Granite, for example, in the last year, we've seen 20,000 VoIP lines pop up. We service now hundreds of thousands of VoIP lines because that's what our businesses want. That's where the technology is headed, especially with copper retirement. However, despite the fact that copper voice and VoIP are nearly identical in the eyes of the consumer, the FCC has failed to classify VoIP as a telecommunication service. So this limits the FCC's ability to enforce the interconnection obligations to VoIP carriers that can lead to a host of problems. These include technical problems, which can impact service quality. This can include competition problems stemming from the lack of regulations to ensure affordable access to the network for competitive carriers. And this can include issues with legal and regulatory authority, which others have spoken to, including the CPNI rules, the network outage reporting rules, and USF contributions. Interconnection has always really been the hallmark of competition. It's based on the founding principles of free trade and multi-network options. Historically, it was actually the lack of interconnection that led to the 100-year AT&T monopoly. And today, because large incumbents can treat VoIP differently than other communication services, we are seeing confusing and inefficient practices in the marketplace, issues that have generally just led to higher prices and market power in negotiations with smaller competitive providers such as Granite. It's really important for us to learn from our history so we can avoid repeating it. Bipartisan competition laws put in place in the 90s helped launch a tech and telecom revolution, which brought millions of jobs and trillions in investments. Companies like Granite, they wouldn't exist if not for smart competition laws. Competition brings innovation, and Granite has developed and deployed the innovation for a one-stop shop service that has helped many businesses, from Fortune 500 companies, car dealerships, banks, schools, small businesses to grow and expand nationwide. Harold, I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you. And, we haven't even touched on some of the more technical things like pole attachments, which is so critically important, but you have to be either a cable service or a telecommunication service to get access to those necessary utility poles. So if you're not, if that doesn't exist anymore, then, there's no access for you. But just to drill down on one of the things that you mentioned in passing, but that is critically important to so many people, is universal service. In 1996, Congress included this provision in the Telecommunications Act, which created the formal universal service fund that we have today. And they made it clear that that was for telecommunications and telecommunication services. So we've seen what happens when one service, text messaging, goes from assumed to be Title II, where they make contribution, to disputed over whether it's Title II, where some people make contribution and some people don't, to definitely not Title II, and now nobody makes text message contribution anymore. So, Olivia, acknowledging, of course, that the FCC, by its ancillary authority, added facilities-based VoIP to the Universal Service Fund contribution. If all of the legacy wires go away and there's nothing that this VoIP is ancillary to, and therefore that requirement also disappears, what happens? I mean, is there anybody paying into the Universal Service Fund anymore?
Oh, well, I'm sure that there will be a workaround devised.
Well, an attempt at a workaround. I mean, who knows?
An attempt at a workaround. Yeah, it is destabilizing to have regulatory uncertainty here.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that we don't know. We hope everything turns out okay on a service on which millions of people rely for a basic need is not exactly a happy way to live. And to imagine that, we will quickly come up with such a workaround that nobody will challenge this and everything will work out just fine is, possible, I suppose, but let's face it, that's not the way anybody would want to bet. So, we're looking at a fund that is already having enormous difficulties. And of course, on the flip side, if there's no telecommunication service to fund, then what happens there? I mean, we saw this with broadband, where the commission tried to do some hand waving when they repealed the Title II classification of broadband, and the court said, no, you can't hand wave that. You have to make a decision. So I think destabilizing is probably a polite word for what we'd be seeing. But Brian, let me ask you. Part of this is the high cost fund, now repurposed as RDOF, which is a part of the USF structure. But what kind of shape are networks in now, particularly those in rural networks, and what can we expect to see going forward as these traditional legacy networks are retired?
Yeah, that's a really important question. As traditional legacy networks are retired, of course, the FCC will lose its authority. Because the FCC's authority, as we've mentioned, relies on those old networks. And so, as you mentioned, there's been some really aggressive activity recently by all carriers, but AT&T included, as well as Lumen. The CWA members call it retiring in place, RIP. But then there's also official retirement under Section 214. So not only will this leave people without a reliable alternative, but as I've mentioned, it will get rid of FCC authority. And so the real risk here, I think, is that the FCC, without that authority, cannot ensure customers have good alternatives once the technologies in the rural locations are retired. And I want to provide a really stark example here. Lumen submitted an application to the FCC to discontinue legacy voice service on Little Gasparilla Island, which is a small 7-mile long island on the Gulf side of Florida. And according to Lumen, only 26 customers subscribe to the phone service there. There's no broadband. But there was no other wireline provider on the island. So Lumen would have left these customers without an adequate alternative landline product, which is a really frightening thing. And as we know, in the wake of tropical storms, these landlines provide more dependability than does cellular service. So the copper retirement there would have had a really important impact on the residents of this island. Fortunately, after objections were raised, including by PK, Lumen withdrew the application. But this just underscores why we need Title II classification so badly, so that the FCC can ensure customers have good alternatives to current technologies. And since all existing phone regulation governing universal service, consumer protection, and competition rest on the existing copper network, once that network goes away, as it is beginning to in rural locations, as you mentioned, so too will the regulation protecting these customers.
So, we're talking about a lot of potential problems here, particularly in rural areas, but problems for everybody. Sana, one of the things that I know is happening now is that the incumbent providers will not negotiate digital interconnection because they don't have to. And we've seen filed at the FCC that this is preventing the implementation of shaken stirred, the anti-spoofing protocol, because in order to get a phone call through, you have to go up to the old TDM legacy interconnection gate point, downgrade your signal from a digital signal to a TDM based signal, and in doing so, that breaks the shake and stirred so that it just doesn't work. But in addition to that, I understand that it also imposes tremendous costs. Can you tell us about how, just from a cost perspective, this interconnection is one of the most basic things in telecommunications. One of the primary purposes for which the FCC was established. Refusal for interconnection was something that created the AT&T monopoly back in the beginning of the 20th century. The FCC seems to think that the market will just provide for digital interconnection. Has it?
That's a great question. So historically, going back to your point, right now, the way that Granite operates and the way that a lot of competitive local exchange carriers operate is that we have wholesale agreements in place with incumbent local exchange carriers because they're required to, by the code, by the law, to provide these services to Granite and to other CLECs at wholesale rates in order to create competition, in order to give businesses and consumers options. And currently, that protection does not apply to VoIP providers. It does not apply to broadband providers, internet providers. So currently, VoIP service providers, they can provide competitive service packages by relying on regulations that allow them to obtain reasonably priced wholesale TDM-based services from incumbent local exchange carriers. These regulations are tied to those traditional TDM-based copper loops, and there's just no equivalent of those types of regulations on fiber optic digital networks. So as a result, when those wholesale packages are unavailable because of the retirement of the old infrastructure or for whatever other reason, then the incumbent service providers can force their competitors, including Granite, to purchase interconnection at exorbitant prices. So other than the notice requirement for retirement of copper networks, there's really nothing that provides that regulatory safeguard to avert the anti-competitive effect of the transition to these digital networks.
Right, and another important impact on competition has to do with the licensing itself, what we call Section 214. Again, the Commission, through its ancillary authority, has extended the 214 requirements to facilities-based IP, voice IP services. But again, if the ancillary authority goes away, that 214 obligation goes away. The Commission loses its jurisdictional hook to review these kinds of transactions, or the obligation of these carriers to give notice even where they're discontinuing their service to get the permission before they stop providing. Is more consolidation going to be good for America if that happens?
Sorry, is that question directed at me?
Yeah, that was a do. I could open it up to the panel, but yeah, but I figured it's, as a competitor, you know, is more competition in an unregulated space going to be good for competition and good for America?
No, it isn't, because historically we've just seen that these players don't play. They don't play with us willingly because they want to. They play with us because the rules and laws are in place to promote competition. Why would carriers offer us, these services at wholesale rates for then us to provide that to businesses, for us to then provide that to schools and to libraries? If it was up to them, they would just get all that business themselves. I mean, this is what we've seen historically with AT&T. It required the government to go, and it required the government to break it all up and create these competitive rules in a competitive environment. And that's how we're seeing we saw such success from businesses, from federal and state governments that have benefited from that competitive resale and the provision of TDM-based telephone service. We don't know what's going to happen if that's not applied to VoIP services. So we need that. We need the FCC to step in.
Yeah, I want to let folks know. I want to open this up to audience questions, and let folks know if you're watching this on Zoom, there is a Q&A icon that you can click on and type in questions. If you're watching this through YouTube, we have folks who are watching that channel who will be able to provide us with, who are going to provide us with the questions. I see one question already in the chat, which is, are there interconnection requirements with the IIJA infrastructure money? No. Now, there is nothing that prevents NTIA from making that a condition or requiring that as a weighting factor and saying, you're more likely to get money if you provide that. So we have certainly urged NTIA to do that. Other parties, particularly the carriers, unsurprisingly, take an opposite view. They say, first of all, that because it's not explicitly required, it must be prohibited, and even if it's permissible, you shouldn't do it. So this is an open question, but unlike the broadband money in the 2009 Infrastructure Act, the broadband money here does not have any kind of interconnection requirement. So while we're waiting for any additional questions, let me go back to Brian. One of the things that people may say is, well, okay, let the states step in. If there's really a problem here and the FCC isn't doing anything, then the states can do it. Has that first, I feel constrained to point out from a lawyer perspective that that's complicated because there's actually a split now in federal circuits as to whether the FCC's refusal to classify a service as Title II effectively preempts the states from any kind of action at all. So in the Eighth Circuit, thanks to the charter decision, the states in the Eighth Circuit are preempted from stepping up if the FCC tries to not, this question. Whereas in the Ninth Circuit, thanks to the net neutrality decision, the states in the Ninth Circuit have the authority to act where the FCC has abdicated authority. But let's assume, you have the opportunity, states have the opportunity. Have states been stepping in on this, even where they know that their networks are already starting to fall apart?
They have, but there's a lot of confusion at the state level, right? Generally, states can regulate to fill gaps in federal policy. We know this. But in the case of VoIP service, federal courts, as you mentioned, and state PUCs have interpreted the level of preemption differently. So this has caused confusion in the states who are not sure what authority they have to protect customers in their states. And so we've seen the impacts of this confusion. That right, the CPUC has recently adopted an order to consider expanding its service quality rules to apply to VoIP as well as wireless providers and broadband providers. We will see what the outcome of that is. But here's another concrete example that highlights the importance of Title II classification. In Minnesota, 911 service under VoIP is not regulated. CWA has heard from the Department of Public Safety there that they encounter periodic challenges with VoIP providers with respect to their 911 call delivery and associated location database accuracy and management. So this can be very problematic for the end user of the service if they need to reach 911 and it hasn't been set up correctly. So as a result, there was a bill in the Minnesota legislature to give the Department of Public Safety the authority to oversee 911 for VoIP. This would have allowed DPS to hold VoIP carriers to the same level of responsibility that they require of both landline and wireless carriers so that consumers can expect to receive an equitable level of 911 service regardless of what type of communication service they choose. Now, just yesterday, I received word that the bill is dead. Industry lobbyists had it pulled, and this then is yet another reason why we need to classify VoIP as Title II at the federal level. So, therefore, to reiterate our point, regulate the service to avoid this type of confusion, not how it's delivered. As you've said over and over, a phone is a phone. And so customers who make calls using VoIP technology should have the same protections as customers that make calls using other technology. And classifying VoIP under Title II will protect consumers, ensure regulatory parity, and will clarify the confusion for these states that we're seeing.
Right. I mean, it's hard to think of anything more essential and more basic than 911 service. And the idea that because of a inaction, the FCC, that there are going to be any Americans, let alone potentially a substantial number of Americans, who are not guaranteed a connection to 911, should be outrageous to all of us. So, I mean, Olivia, let me put a question to you. A lot of people, this brings up a point. A lot of people will say, well, internet, who needs the phone anymore? I just use Zoom. Why do I need, why do I care about a phone connection? Who cares about the phone? If it's, are there still people who use it, and are they, people who are particularly vulnerable, who need this kind of communication?
Yes. One, I would argue that we all rely on our phone, particularly in times of crisis and emergency, to reach 911, to find out, post disaster, where to go. Certainly to receive emergency alerts, but low-income households, the elderly, households in rural parts of the country are still very much rely on their phone. I would also say that, there's a reason why we still have like toll-free calling and toll-free numbers to find out information on how to get benefits, right? It's not everybody. We have a digital divide. Not everybody is online. And we have segments of the low income population that we know are heavily smartphone reliant as their only form of broadband connectivity, to the extent they have broadband connectivity. So this is essential for all of us, again, going back to the public safety reason, but it is also essential for those who are some of the most vulnerable households in the country.
Yeah, and voice remains a very popular service. And again, we're talking about not just your home landline. We're talking about how it extends to mobile and wireless as well. Another example that occurred to me is we're all moving to two-factor identification. I recently had a personal experience with this, where my mother-in-law lost her cell phone, and then she was trying to access the website to try to get it corrected. She had a different phone that she was using with a different phone number, and was trying to access the service. And in order to access the service, it said, "We have texted to your phone number," and of course, that's the phone that's lost. She had a with her Gmail account, and needed to get into Gmail account, and couldn't remember her password. And again, it was like, well, two-factor identification, we have texted the confirmation code to your phone number of the phone you've lost. So we don't think about the many ways that we all still use phones and are connected to phones, and why this is a service that remains so important. And even though, again, we're talking about a narrow classification question of just this facilities-based, interconnected VoIP, that's the thread, or the line, if you will, on which the entire FCC jurisdiction over this critical infrastructure now hangs.
I would also like to point out, not just the consumers, but I think government and local governments rely on phone service for delivery of information, for access to benefits. There's a reason why phone numbers are always listed on who to contact for what. We rely on the phone trees, the IVR, when you call in. That's a way a lot of businesses sort of handle first line inquiries from their consumers. So it's not just consumers rely on their phones to connect, but also the rest of society is relying on that phone as a phone to connect.
Yep. And there are a lot of online businesses that tried not to have a voice helpline, and they certainly still try to utilize it, but they can't get away from it. So many people need it. Now, do have one question here from Adwait Jawale, who is, full disclosure, was here at PK as a extern, who asks, now in the era of fiber and cable and wireless broadband with no underlying copper, should Congress do away with the separate definitions of telecommunications and information service and just merge them into one? And I will say it's, a good theoretical argument as to whether what we've called the stovepipe arrangement of the Communications Act that makes this kind of service definition so important to the authority and nature of regulation, whether we ought to get rid of that, whether we should somehow, but that's a question that is complicated and where there's no clear answer, and where you would need Congress to act and move a statute through. And by the time we got done with all of that, the FCC would be well out of authority to oversee our critical infrastructure. So, whatever the right answer is there, I will say, we've given the FCC a softball here. We've given the FCC the lightest lift possible. Take the thing that is clearly a phone and just say, yeah, consumers, businesses, all of you people who subscribe to this, you're right. That's a phone, not a weird thing that looks and acts and, pretends it's a phone, but is somehow not a phone for our for when it comes to making sure that it works and making sure that you have the protections that you're used to enjoying over a phone. So I see we've got just a few minutes left. I don't know, Michelle, do we have any questions on the YouTube channel? Okay, I'm told we don't, so I will close here by just asking each one of the panelists here, if you were, sitting there with the FCC, the five, hopefully someday, or at least for the moment, the four FCC commissioners, and you had just 1 minute to tell them why this is the most important, why this is so important, and why they need to move on this. And it's not about politics or Republican versus Democrat. It's just important and needs to happen. What would you want to tell them? Let's start with Sana.
Great, thanks, Harold. I would tell them that technology is moving forward and competition laws need to move forward with it. And having a cop on the beat like the FCC to protect consumers and small businesses from price gouging and poor service is really important. We're 2 decades into VoIP services, and it's time to really enshrine some core competition principles by classifying VoIP as a telecommunication service and providing it with all those protections.
Great. And Brian, what would you want to tell them?
I would say that this issue is important for consumers and for competition, yes, but also for workers who want to be out there building and maintaining networks, who want to get restoration up quickly following disasters, but of course don't control deployment decisions. So Title II classification for VoIP would help ensure timely restoration, regulatory parity, and quality service, which are important to telecom workers.
Thank you. And Olivia, what would you want to tell them?
Well, certainly just the regulatory certainty with the facilities-based VoIP is just essential for core consumer protections and expectations, which consumers have had the privilege of, benefiting from all along, with privacy, truth in billing, ensuring there's a reliable, affordable, quality voice service available when you pick up that phone and you need it the most. You don't want to say, oh my God, what's the underlying technology, because this is not working.
And I'll just say for me, the one thing I'd want to tell them is guys, I wrote 70 pages on this. Just read the petition and give us what we need, because that's the law and that's the right policy. So I want to thank our panelists here for participating. I want to thank all of you who came this afternoon to listen. We will, I think in a relatively short period of time, have the recording of this panel on our Public Knowledge YouTube channel. So hopefully tell your friends that this is important, and that when we get the link out, that this is something that they need to know about and be prepared to fight for. So thank you all.